The ancient Greek city of Delphi, located on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, was home to the main temple of Apollo and the renowned Delphic oracle. According to legend, the site was found by Zeus, the king of the gods, who sought to find the center of the earth goddess Gaia, or his grandmother Earth. Zeus then sent 2 eagles flying from the eastern and western extremities of the earth. The 2 eagles crossed paths over Delphi. Zeus marked the spot in which the paths of his eagles crossed with a large egg-shaped stone called the Omphalos, which means navel. The ancient Greeks revered this site as the center of the world, as indicated by the Omphalos stone monument found on the site, and it has since been recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site due to its immense influence in the ancient world. Homeric literature often references the sacred temple of Apollo. In the Iliad, Achilles refused to accept Agamemnon's attempt to reconcile, even if it included all the riches held within the rocky Pythos' hallowed stone floor. Achilles was referring to Delphi, of course, and as it happens, an excavation at Delphi has yielded an increasing number of artifacts, such as pottery, bronze, and tripod dedications, since the latter quarter of the 8th century BC. The variety of artifacts, the presence of prominent dedications, as well as the huge quantity of rich objects, lend support to Achilles' claim. In the Odyssey, Agamemnon crosses the same stone floor to receive a prophecy from Apollo in Delphi. In Theogony, Hesiod also refers to Pytho in the hollows of Parnassus. This implies that the earliest known date of the oracle's existence is the 8th century BC, the probable date of composition of the Homeric works. In the 19th century, Delphi was still frequently visited by many renowned artists who proceeded to create works based on the site. These works included diaries, sketches, and views of the area, as well as depictions of coins. These illustrations typically reflected the spirit of Romanticism, as seen in the drawings of German archaeologist Otto Magnus von Stackelberg. Notable figures such as the poet Lord Byron, who was accompanied by poet and painter William Haygarth, also visited Delphi and wrote about their experiences. A Homeric hymn to Apollo dates to the 7th century BC, connects Apollo to the site through his epithet Delphinios, the Delphinian, relates the myth of Apollo's journey in search of a place for his oracle. He was advised by his companion Telephus to choose Crissa, below the glade of Parnassus. North of the valley junction, a spur of Parnassus looms over the valley, and it was here that Crissa, a Mycenaean stronghold, was located. Middle Helladic in origin, 1900 to 1550 BC, Crissa was mentioned in the Iliad's catalogue of ships. The site was originally an oracle of the earth goddess Gaia. Apollo built a temple and killed the serpent Pytho, who guarded the site and drove Gaia away, thus claiming the temple of Delphi for his own oracle. When some Cretans from Knossos later sailed up to Apollo's temple, Apollo transformed into a dolphin and cast himself on the deck of their boat. In awe, the Cretans did not dare to remove him from the ship, and so he guided them around Greece and back to Crissa, where the ship ran aground. The hymn tells us that the Cretans cried out to Apollo in fear, "O Lord, seeing that thou hast led us away from our kin and the land of our fathers, how are we now to exist?" Apollo laughed at them and ordered them to slaughter the sheep that men will bring in abundance to his temple, each holding the sacrificial knife. Thus Apollo made his home in a shrine with Cretan priests offering him reverential worship, known as worship of Delphineus, or the dolphin. There are, of course, other versions of this story. One version says that Apollo shoots his first arrow as a newborn, killing the serpent Pytho, son of Gaia, who had been guarding the area. Apollo was then forced to flee and serve for 8 years to be forgiven for the murder of Gaia's son. Another legend tells that Apollo killed the chthonic serpent Python because the serpent was preventing Leto from bearing Apollo and Artemis. The temple at Delphi is revealed in the opening scene of Aeschylus's Eumenides. Before entering the inner sanctuary, the Pythia begins the prologue with a prayer. In this prayer I honor Earth, the first prophetess, as the first of the gods. This seat, prophetic, was appropriated by Themis from her mother. So the story goes. Another Titan child of Earth, Phoebe, sat here with her free will in the third place through no one's violence. She gave it as a birth gift to Phoebus, who gets his name from Phoebe. Aeschylus is handling the traditional myths with zeal, and he is careful to preserve as much detail as possible of the divine beings. Therefore, although he is eager to stress the peaceful and voluntary nature of these changes, he is also quite clear in telling us the worship of Apollo displaced that of older and cruder divinities. Aeschylus appears to have overlooked an important feature of the local myth, that Poseidon the earth-shaker shared possession of the original oracle. Poseidon appears to have been the chief divinity of the Eastern Greek world at one time, but is depicted in many legends as waging a losing battle for land control with Apollo. Those familiar with Poseidon's famous quarrel with Athena, in which Poseidon lost, would understand that the losing side in such a struggle is frequently relegated to a minor role in the local cult, and so it happened with Poseidon in Delphi. Aeschylus did not seem to like to tell stories of divine quarrels, but these stories are still important, as Poseidon worship, with its human sacrifices, slaughter of horses, and so on, is a type of the primeval savage state before the arrival of the Enlightenment and civilization represented by Apollo. Poseidon was also given a lesser role in the Delphic ritual. His altar was located within the temple, and he is indeed invoked by the priestess later in this prayer at the beginning of Aeschylus's drama. When the traveler Pausanias arrived in Delphi near the end of his journey through Greece in the 2nd century of our era, he recorded some of the most amazing legends that had sprung up around the shrine. He was told that the first temple was a hut made of laurel boughs brought from Tempe's valley. There appears to have been a close original connection, never completely forgotten, between the Delphi ritual and northeastern Thessaly. Apollo descends from Olympus into Pieria and then passes through Iolcus on his way to Pytho, according to the Homeric hymn. Tempe supplied the laurel for the victor's wreaths in the Pythian games. In that region, the laurel grows luxuriantly and forms little groves upon elevated spots, a most intriguing but mysterious ceremony called Septaria, celebrated at Delphi every 8th year, and well known since at least the 4th century BC, appears to belong here as well. A boy, whose parents must still be alive, set fire to a tent pitched in the open, then fled without looking back. This was thought to be a symbolic atonement rite for the slaying of the dragon. The boy, impersonating Apollo, immediately left the city, and his wanderings eventually led him to Tempe, where purification ceremonies were held. This legend, by the way, confirms the opinion that the local myths always held to the story of a violent seizure of Delphi by Apollo. Builders named Trophonios and Agamedes, who were brothers, built a temple on the site out of stone, according to Pausanias. However, the Homeric hymn names these architects as the builders of the original temple under Apollo's personal supervision. Pindar wrote a story about the two men, illustrating that melancholy view of human life that, while not uncommon among Greek stories, changes our preconceived notion of their light and buoyant nature. The brothers asked the god for the highest reward in his gift for their labor in building the temple, and they were told it would be granted on the 7th day. Meanwhile, he wished them a feast and joy. But, having lain down on the appointed day, they fell asleep, never to wake up again. Bacchus or Dionysus is a much less frequent companion of Apollo, but he is far more prominent at Delphi than Athena. Indeed, it is possible that his worship predates that of Apollo. One legend says that he was the first to possess the oracle. along with night. When slain by the Titans, Dionysus was said to have been buried by Apollo in Delphi. The Delphic year's winter months were dedicated to him, with Apollo absent from the sanctuary. Furthermore, while Apollo and Artemis shared the eastern pediment with their mother Leto and the Muses, Dionysus and his Maenads, or frenzied women worshippers, occupied the corresponding position at the western side. He was consecrated to the shining cliffs above Delphi, and the even higher slopes of Parnassus were his favorite resort for his nightly revels. A most famous allusion to the region is in Sophocles' Ode to Dionysus in Antigone, which says, "The torchlight lurid upon thee shines above the double-crested cliff, where the Corycian nymphs as bacchantes march besides Castalia's stream." The figure of the Pythia also has a long history. The chemical vapors that caused the Delphic oracle to deliver her prophecies were said to have come from the Castalian spring, which flowed towards the temple. Originally dedicated to Gaia and shared with Poseidon, this temple was later renamed Pythia in honor of the oracle. Since the 2nd millennium BC, the Sibyl, or frenzied women through whom the god spoke, had already been recorded in the Near East. The Sibyl was first mentioned in writing by Heraclitus in 5 BC, who described her as uttering things not to be laughed at, unadorned and unperfumed, yet reaches to 1,000 years, with her voice by the aid of the god. According to folklore, the first of the Greek Sibyls was Herophile, who was sometimes described as Apollo's daughter, sister, or wife, and other times as the child of a fisherman and a nymph. Herophile is said to have traveled from the Troad to Delphi before the Trojan War, and to have died in the Troad after having outlived 9 generations of people. She was thought to still bring future prophecies to those who heard her after she died. A more popular legend held that Apollo lusted after Diphobe, Marpessa, and Cassandra, and gave them the gift of prophecy as a sign of his affections. In Delphi, the priestesses were originally young maidens, but when one of them became susceptible to influences other than Apollo's inspiration, a widow over the age of 50 was always chosen. There was only one Pythia in the beginning, but the height of Delphi's fame, 3 people held the office at the same time. To place herself more fully under the divine influence, the Pythia chewed sacred laurel leaves and drank from the holy spring before mounting the tripod to make her prophecy. No doubt she, like those seeking divination, was enthralled by the strange rich odors, possibly incense, that we hear, as well as music. If her responses were too incoherent or unpoetical, they were reduced to writing and hexameter verse by the attendant priests and delivered to the questioner, either orally or on a sealed tablet. An Athenian delegation consulted the oracle in the lead-up to the Persian invasion in 480 BC, and were given 2 lines that were very confusing for them. Eventually they concluded that it was a reference to the wooden trireme ships they should build up and use to engage in battle. This event marked the beginning of the Persian retreat and the return of freedom to the Greek world. This is only one of the many examples of the profound effect the Oracle of Delphi has had on the political landscape of ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks had a strong faith in the oracle's words, even if their interpretation was not always clear. People from all over the Mediterranean region sought advice from the Oracle of Delphi. Delphi was also visited by famous figures such as Socrates and Oedipus. People consulted the oracle not only for personal matters, but also for state matters. This gave the Delphi oracle great power over political, economic, and religious events. The oracle of Delphi allowed believers to hear the words of the god Apollo spoken through a priestess called Pythia. This oracular effect was thought to come from fumes from a fissure in the rock near the temple. To take part in the ritual, participants were required to pay a levy and sacrifice a goat at the altar. The priestess would then be put into a trance-like state induced by the hallucinogenic fumes, allowing Apollo to take over her spirit and speak prophecies. The answers given by the oracle were often cryptic and complex, leading many to believe they were not meant to be understood by ordinary mortals. and thus requires translations from the priests of the temple. One of the most famous visitors of the Oracle of Delphi was Lycurgus, reformer of the Spartan state. Herodotus wrote about this episode in which the Pythia addressed Lycurgus as a god. Although Herodotus did not elaborate much further, it was believed that after this the Pythia gave instructions for how to reform Sparta and turn it into a powerful state. It was due to these divine words the Spartans were able to become one of the greatest city-states in ancient Greece. Athens has also felt the effects of the Oracle of Delphi. Around 594 BC, Athenian statesman Solon, circa 630 to 560 BC, consulted the oracle about the state of his home city and was given the advice to position himself now amidships, for he was the pilot of Athens. Solon used this advice to make far-reaching constitutional reforms that benefited the wider populace and steered Athens away from its current political system. It should be noted that the relationship between Pythia and ancient rulers was not always amicable. An example of this was the story of Croesus. Croesus ruled over Lydia, which is now part of modern-day Turkey, from around 560 to 546 BC. He is also regarded as one of the wealthiest men in history. Herodotus gives a detailed account of his life, emphasizing Croesus's arrogance, especially directly related to his power and wealth. This is made abundantly clear during his visits to the Oracle of Delphi. Croesus wanted to know which oracle was the most accurate early in his reign. As a result, he devised a test to determine which oracle would provide the most precise answer. He asked each oracle to tell him what he was doing at a specific point in time, a question that only he could answer. The Pythia, predictably, provided the correct answer. Impressed, Croesus sent a slew of gold and silver dedications to Delphi. Soon after, Croesus began to plan an invasion of his powerful neighbor Persia, so he returned to Delphi to seek Pythia's counsel. Pythia's answer was, "If you go to war with the Persians, you will destroy a great empire." Croesus, thinking that the great empire that Pythia was referring to was Persia, carried out his plans and ended up losing his own kingdom as a result. Before his invasion of Persia, Alexander the Great is said to have visited the Oracle of Delphi. When Alexander arrived, the oracle was closed for the winter, and he begged the guards to let him in, but they refused. He then broke into the temple, grabbed Pythia by the hair, and dragged her to the altar, demanding a prophecy. The Pythia cried out in outrage, "Boy, you are invincible," which Alexander translated as, "You shall not be beaten in battle." This was true enough, as Alexander did not die beaten in a war. However, he did die at the height of his success, at the age of 32, from an illness. A Thracian tribe attacked Delphi in 83 BC, burning down the temple, desecrating the sanctuary, and stealing the sacred fire from the altar. The temple was heavily damaged by an earthquake the same year, leading to its eventual demise as the local population dwindled and the posts became difficult to fill. However, this did not stop the Roman Emperor Nero years later when attempted to learn the time and circumstances of his death from the oracle, only to receive the response, "Beware of the 73rd year." Whatever Nero's interpretation of this message is unclear, but he was indeed killed by Galba, who was 73 years old at the time.